Hey guys, it's Mystical Storms here with a new fanfiction. This is a fanfic I've been wanting to read for a while. I found it with skits on TikTok, so yeah. Sorry. This is called Colorblind in a Vibrant World by Wawaka, and I'll read you guys a summary. Denki nods, and a faint smirk pulled at the other boy's lips as he looked down at Izuku. Yeah, I want knives. Izuku hummed as he pretended to contemplate it, even as a smirk overtook his own grin. Knives would sound like an amazing idea. Who are we going for first? Denki's smirk grew wider and much more vicious as he thought about his first victim, Nomu, or in which Midoriya and Kaminari get stuck in a time loop during the USJ attack together. Okay. So there are gonna have some trigger warnings. I have to go through the tags to find them. So there's temporary character death. It's a fix-it of sorts. Emotional hurt, blood and gore, mild gore, blood and violence, cannibalism, stabbing, suicidal thoughts, reference to depression, murder, torture, broken bones, dark comedy, loneliness, vomiting, unhealthy coping mechanism, unforeseen simulation joint arc, so like the USJ arc, mental instability, and yeah, that's all I can see here. Yep. Okay. Sorry. And this is a her comfort, so it's, yeah. Anyway, if those things are just not things you like or make you uncomfortable or anything, just go check out my other videos. I have, I think, 25 uploaded, so you'll have options. Anyway, without further notice, this is Colorblind in a Vibrant World, and let's begin. Chapter 1. The Time Loop. I am here, I am here, I am here, I am here, I am here. Izuku lets his hand gently come down on his alarm clock and groaned when he saw the time. Christ, it was too early to be awake, but Izuku knew he needed to get up and move if he wanted to have enough time to go for a run, actually make himself some breakfast today. He rolled himself out of bed, landing on his feet, stretched, enjoying the tight feeling of his muscles. Quickly, he grabbed a pair of workout clothes and ran out of his front door towards the beach. Ever since he cleaned up the beach, it's been one of his favorite places to run along, if only to breathe in the early ocean breeze, before anyone else had the opportunity to do so. The beach is some place Izuku started to think as a safe place for him. The smell of the ocean and the feel of sand underneath his feet calmed something crazed within his mind. Izuku had little doubt that he would spend a whole day sitting and staring out to see where the sky and the sea touched each other. All too soon, Izuku was running back to the house, a little more than hesitant to deal with whatever might be behind the door waiting for him. For the first few days of the school, his mother had been incredibly overbearing and worrying over letting him leave the house, but after that, she seemed to go back to being content by ignoring Izuku's existence and working overtime to get out of the house. He's not really sure which Inko he preferred dealing with. On one hand, the overbearing thing makes everyone look at their relationship and see a worried mother and a fondling, exasperated son, which means no one butts into his personal life. On the other hand, it's always weird in his house, like something's always been slightly off and only select few can actually feel it. So he walks through the front door with his breath held tightly in his chest as he toed off his running shoes and silently made his way towards the kitchen. Izuku sighed a breath of relief at the impersonal note sitting at the kitchen counter, all but promising that Inko wouldn't be at the house for 3 days, and he was on his own for the meantime. With more of a pep in his step, Izuku made his way down the hallway, took a hot shower, threw on his school uniform, and tossed together a simple breakfast before heading out. Izuku smiled to himself, excited about his day. It was going to be a good day. He just felt it. Apparently, Izuku's sense of what a good day meant was fucked up. He already knew this since he had lived most of his life thinking his day was relatively peaceful, one when Kachan and his cronies only yelled about his worthlessness before leaving him all alone. But still, Izuku had hoped that he would have correctly guessed while this day would have gone had stupid and quite frankly rude villains not interrupted their rescue training. Izuku got dropped off through a warp villain quirk towards a shipwreck zone with Sue. Even while they were facing villains, she still demanded that they call her by her given name and Midoriya. Quite honestly, Izuku didn't know what Midoriya was even doing here, since the boy was busy crying more than Izuku could ever hope to as soon as Izuku tried to come up with a plan to get them back to the shore. And with 2 broken fingers, Izuku and his classmates finally made it back to the edge of the center plaza. Surrounding his classroom, his homeroom teacher, were all the villains that had been standing were now knocked unconscious. Suddenly, the big, bulky villain, Nomu, that's what the tin handyman called them, darted towards Eraserhead and slammed them into the ground over and over until the man's blood was splashing every time his head made contact with it. Petals before him, and Izuku could hear Eraserhead's skull squish as it kept making impact. Izuku wanted to throw up and scream and cry, or fight all of the villains and hurt them as well, but his body was frozen. Even his thoughts ran rampant. Quickly, the villains with hands all over him dashed over to where Izuku, Tsu, and Mineta were watching. Izuku felt his body surge in motion and yanked Tsu back behind him, pushing his 2 classmates away. He felt the moment that the handed villain had finally reached them and placed his dry hand directly on Izuku's chest. In that moment, Izuku idly berated himself for thinking that broken fingers ever hurt, because this was agonizing and burning pain. A guttural scream ripped through Izuku's throat as the itching pain made its way through his body and mind. Even though the pain, Izuku could feel his skin and muscles and bones flake into nothing as it turned to dust before his watery eyes. He forced himself to look up at the malice and pleased grin at the villain face, lips splitting into with how wide it was. Manic and gleeful eyes met his own, and Izuku could only vow to himself that he would make this villain's life a living hell in his next life as darkness overtook his vision and he stuttered out his last breath. I am here. Izuku slammed his fist onto the alarm clock, not even caring to look at the time as he bolted in bed and looked around the room, trying to calm his racing heart. He looked around the room, trying to find anything different, anything that would indicate he hadn't just had the most vivid nightmare of his life. He doesn't usually have nightmares that are vivid or new. Usually there are recurring nightmares like Hachan's lackeys or his father coming back. This was the first time he ever thought of his classmates and teacher dying by a villain attack. Izuku doesn't even know where this came from. He didn't think they were supposed to have a field trip today. He never seen the inside of the USJ. Izuku just sluggishly made his way off his bed and lay back onto the floor, wondering where that specific nightmare could have come from. Maybe his subconscious was worried about something. Whatever it was going to have to wait. Izuku pulled himself up, sitting and nodded himself, opting for a small core workout rather than going for a run today. In all honesty, he truly didn't feel like leaving the house, but it would make him feel much better to see all his classmates and teachers alive and well. So he just mindlessly let himself work out enjoying the tightening and flexing of his abs, feeling a bit sore, marginally better by the time he was finished. Izuku got up and took a quick shower before throwing on his school uniform and heading out the kitchen, wondering if he should make for breakfast. As he came out, he nearly had a heart attack when he looked at a note his mother left him, already knowing what it was going to say. With a shaky hand, Izuku threw the note away and turned back towards the coffee machine. Desperate to have some sort of warmth flow through his body, Izuku let himself compartmentalize as he stared at his coffee. He didn't actually know if the note was just from this morning or yesterday, since he ran out of the house, almost missed the train the day before. He would have subconsciously seen the note and made it a part of his nightmare. That's entirely plausible. Then the whole field trip issue. Izuku always had the most wild imagination, and he'd never been able to recall his dreams and nightmares so vividly before. They always faded, and usually as he opened his eyes, only leaving him with a sense of unease for the day. Right now, Izuku cringed at remembering what happened to Aizawa-sensei's brain and how it seemed to be falling out of his head, only to get pushed right back into his skull, met with concrete. It was a new feeling of disturbed that Izuku didn't think he would have reached as he became a pro hero. He would have recognized that something like his nightmare could always happen, and that's why he was training to be better. But goddammit, he really doesn't know how to handle that. Izuku felt annoyed as he realized that what could have happened. His nightmare was just like a gory movie he had watched a few weeks ago. Maybe his brain decided to just omit some details, switch some plot lines around, and give him a horrific nightmare, possibly, but something still felt off. Izuku sighed to himself as he made his way through UA, and hopefully he'd figure out what felt wrong. Izuku officially feels like the white girl in one of those horror movies. Just a tad too stupid to figure out what was happening, scared beyond measure, and way too annoyed at himself to care completely about what was going on. The villain showed up at the exact same manner that they did last time. The war villain warped away Kachan and Kirishima again before they wrapped 13's attack back at them, splitting their suits and injuring them, and then the villain warped everyone around various parts of the USJ. This time, though, Izuku was warped away with Ojiro and landed in a fire zone. Fire surrounded them, and villains began making their way through. Izuku just grimly nodded towards his partner, who responded in kind, and both of them started fighting for their lives. Izuku powered up one for all, punched through the new wave of villains at the fire, effectively shutting the fire down and knocking them back of unconscious with the air force he had sent their way. Sure, he had a broken arm now, but it doesn't hurt as bad as what I thought it would. Suddenly, a pained cry sounded from behind him as he turned to see a villain get the upper hand on Ojiro and stabbing his tail roughly between, slicing his throat of his classmate, dropped heavily to the ground. The villain just grinned with a wide manic eyes, and Izuku growled as he felt One For All activate again. There was something about the villain's eye that reminded Izuku of a villain from the last time that made him want to tear every one of these villains apart piece by piece. So Izuku launched himself over the villain and struck him hard as he could, letting out a muffled groan when the villain retaliated and stabbed his lower stomach. Izuku dropped to his knees as he watched the villain fly through the fire and landed with a thunderous crack on the ground. He let his hand grip the knife and embedded it in him as he breathed heavily, trying to push past the pain and force himself up to his feet. As soon as he got to his feet, Izuku stumbled and fell back down, watching as darkness started to creep up and around his vision. He can only let himself succumb to darkness as he listened to unconscious villains surrounding him, laughing loudly at his failure. I am here. Izuku bolted up out of bed, raced around the bathroom, frantically pulling his shirt up and off of him as he did so. He could still feel the blood coating his fingers and sticking to his shirt. The image of the villain slicing Ojiro's throat was branded behind his eyelids, making it impossible to calm his frantic heart. He burst through the bathroom door and took the image of himself. His chest was heavily moved up and down as he tried to breathe and force back the bile from his throat. His arms were perfectly fine, with an explanation to some mild scarring that wasn't there before. Tentatively, Izuku ran his fingers across his chest, noticing the faint handprint resting directly over his heart. A bit lower, a white line where the knife was embedded itself into Izuku's rested, breaking up the symmetry outline of his abs. Izuku exhaled roughly and let his hands run through his hair as he stared to himself some more. It wasn't some terrible nightmare, nor was it any part of his imagination. He was really stuck dying and watching everyone else die over and over because of an attack that was supposed to happen today during their class. Why was this happening? What was making him relive this awful day over and over? Perhaps a time loop quirk, but those are heavily regulated, and anyone hoping to be a villain with that quirk would be easily recognizable. So what the fuck is happening to Izuku? Is he supposed to save everyone? He lets his eyelids close, and though as he felt heavy tears running down his face, he just some wordless kid got blessed with a kid not even a full month ago. How the hell was he supposed to save his classmates and defeat the villains? Obviously, they had no claims about killing children, even if they are heroes in training. They're just kids. And the warp villain talked about their group wanting to kill All Might, even though the man wasn't even there for class. He was not blaming All Might, not at all, because he has absolutely no idea how All Might could even help them past defeating the monster that sits in Plaza each time. And obviously his mentor was busy doing something else today, which is fine. Izuku wondered if he could write all of this down somewhere. Everything else seems to be resetting except him, so not sure what's worded. Then again, he always worked better seeing it through spread across a notebook. Izuku quickly made his way around the kitchen and stared at the fresh pot of coffee before going back to his room, getting dressed and grabbing a notebook. He made his way out of the dining table and began writing down everything he knew about the attack of the villain. Occasionally, Izuku got up, poured himself some coffee as he wrote out everything he could remember. He felt vaguely settled afterwards, looking through the notes he had just written. It seemed like his death is the reset of the day. So, if a classmate or teacher dies, all he has to do is make sure he dies too. That way, the class would be relatively safe until he could figure out how to help everyone. Izuku sighed to himself as he left the house, grabbing his coffee mug on the way out. At this point, he couldn't give a shit less about what happened, though. What happened to him? About what others thought of him. He needed some coffee to get him through this mess of a day. Izuku was admittedly very close to murdering Summer and becoming a villain himself. Maybe not technically a villain, since the only person he wants to kill happens to be villains, but he can't really bring himself to care about the schematics. He tried to tell Aizawa-sensei not to jump into the fray at the plaza, but of fucking course his teacher didn't listen to him, and Izuku just cursed loudly, taking small amounts of time to smile at the disbelieving cackle from Kaminari, and jumped down into the plaza with the man. He fought like his life depended on it, not sparing a single glance towards Aizawa-sensei. He was still trying to get Izuku to leave him, and then someone else seemed to jump down after the warp villain showed up and warped everyone away. Izuku let his body turn with the leftover momentum from his punch and saw Kaminari going at it with the rest of the villains, grinning viciously. He looked over towards Izuku and hummed questionably before asking, "How often do you come here?" Izuku just laughed, although it sounded more like a cackle, letting relief flood through his bones as he jumped in the air and twirled around the villain, locking them into a headlock and punching the top of his head, knocking them out. "This is my third time sightseeing. How about you?" Izuku responded, looking over to notice that Kaminari had smiled genuinely. His eyes seemed to be full of happiness. "Really?" Izuku said, being intrigued, wiping around to kick a villain away and tase them with his quirk. "Me too." Just like that, Izuku had found someone who could help him with their classmates and prevent him of murder should he get to that point. That was his downfall, and he kept his eyes on Kaminari, completely forgetting about the decay-loving psychopath behind him. Izuku groaned as he felt a familiar feeling in his body decaying away, listening to the horrified cries of his teacher, not even bothering to hide it when he rolled his eyes at the monologue the villain was spouting. Izuku was pretty sure Kaminari was muttering something about a hand fetish in an unoriginal, and about how unoriginal he was. Izuku was pretty sure Kaminari muttered something about a hand finish and unoriginality, but he wasn't too sure since he was quickly falling into the familiar pool of darkness. "I am here. I am here." Izuku slams his alarm clock against the closet door, taking a second to breathe before jumping out of bed and sliding into his desk chair. Had no idea, especially since he now knows that Kaminari was stuck in a time loop with him. Izuku let himself pull up an anonymous tip line for the police and typed up all that he could remember about the attack, what time it had happened, and who was likely going to be there. As soon as it was done, Izuku went to UA's homepage and pulled up the code, looking through it all for a backdoor and finally finding one that he could use with relative ease. Quickly, he searched up for Kaminari's file and found his phone number and address. Izuku typed in the two and sent Kaminari a message and walked out towards the kitchen. As expected, the notebook was left on the dining room table, was gone, and he put it against the shelf in his room. He grumbled to himself as he grabbed the notes his mother left and threw it away again before wandering over to the coffee pot. His phone dinged, but only to tell him that he couldn't message anyone at the time, which worried him. He knew Kaminari was stuck in a loop with him. That much was obvious since only him and Kaminari seemed to be the ones changing places during the attack. So, are they stuck in a time loop with no effective way to get any outside help? Izuku took a look at his phone and noticing how he can access anything messaging or calling wise. He raced back into his room, looked at his laptop, groaning when he noticed that his tip for the police didn't even go through. Izuku just took a deep breath to steady himself and tried to focus on drinking his coffee, ignoring the salty tears that were mixing in with his bitter drink. Alone, that wasn't a new concept for Izuku, but it still sent a pang of hurt through him, all the same. Especially since he knows Kaminari is stuck here with him as well, which means they're both being isolated from the outside world. How lovely. Izuku just resigned himself to grabbing his coffee mug and making his way to Kaminari's house, which was closer than he thought it'd be. He stood awkwardly in the front door, shifting his backpack around, slipping his mug into his left hand before he knocked. A few seconds later, the door swung open wide, with Kaminari's panting and quickly ushering him inside the house before closing and locking the door. "Hey," Kaminari said breathlessly, eyes wide as he took in the sight of Izuku. "Hey, yourself," Izuku said quietly, grinning from ear to ear. He was happy that someone was living through this nightmare with him, as terrible and selfish as it was. "I tried to call into the school, but nothing's working," Kaminari said with a slight frown, walking back towards his kitchen as Izuku followed him, nodding along. "Not sure why, but I couldn't get anything out either. I tried to give a tip to the police, but it didn't go through," Izuku said, silently confirming that they were only on their own for this. Kaminari just sighed and entirely nodded. Izuku felt his curiosity peak when he noticed a small white line across the other boy's neck, right above his Adam's apple, but he knew better than to ask about it, especially since Izuku wasn't even ready for people to ask him about his own scars. Although he wouldn't mind sharing them with Kaminari, the only one who would hope to know he felt about the failure painting his skin. It was odd for Izuku to see the usually vibrant boy looking so dull and muted, although Izuku could guess he looked the same. If it was as if Izuku was slowly going colorblind, not able to stop and look around at the once vibrant world around them. That doesn't surprise him, since he never really looked around at the world before and admired the beauty, but it felt like a loss of some sort. Kaminari walked around to his dining table and gestured to Izuku to sit down. "Have you eaten yet, Mido?" Izuku shook his head and walked over. "Not yet. And call me Izuku, please." Kaminari gave a weak grin and sent Izuku a cheesy thumbs up as he responded. "Then call me Denki. Now eat up. We've got villains to fight and friends to save." Izuku smiled weakly as he felt determination course through his body. Yeah, they would fix the loop one of these days. Apparently, one of these days meant not anytime soon. Izuku and Denki gone through 4 more loops at this point, with various classmates dying in more and more gruesome ways before they themselves were killed. Worse was watching Aizawa's neck snap clean, his head nearly rolling off his shoulders before he had been curb stomped by the Nomu against the corner of the fountain. It was mostly fascinating to watch fountain color quickly change into a pink color with Aizawa's blood, as if it was food coloring. Izuku just grumbled to himself as he walked over to Denki's house and let himself in. The boy had grown much closer over the past couple loops, talking about things no one else would really understand and cracking the most morbid jokes in the effort to keep himself sane. Izuku got Denki used to physical touch fairly quickly, since he was worried about zapping Izuku on accident, but Izuku just shot him a deadpan look and said, "After all of these loops, you think a little zap from you would hurt me?" And then he officially caved to that. Since then, the boys would automatically seek out comfort from one another. Izuku rested his forehead on Denki's back when the other boy was cooking, and Denki could just do the same to him. Then he draped his feet around Izuku's lap, across Izuku's lap when they were sitting down on the bus for the USJ, and just at the dining table. Izuku also tended to just close his eyes and enjoy the weight of Denki's chin resting on his head as he absorbed the facts that they were alive and not as dead as they seemed to be a few loops ago. They had also tried to tell Aizawa-sensei about the incoming attack on the 5th loop. With Denki's insistence, Izuku didn't really trust Aizawa to believe them, and Izuku was right. Aizawa just thought they were paranoid during that loop and kept glancing at them like they were crazy. Izuku didn't even bother holding back his bitter laughter when the villain came that loop, exasperately pointing out that the villains to our future before diving into the plaza off the stairs right behind Denki once again, as he listened to the other boy make fun of another one. As he listened to the other boy make fun of everyone's mom while they fought. Izuku opened up the fridge, got started on making some eggs and rice, opting to wait a bit before he worked on the fish. One thing that he found out quickly was that Denki woke up about an hour after Izuku, and most of the time Izuku couldn't just be alone in his house. So he would walk over to Denki's, let himself in, and get started on breakfast. It is something dark and anxious in his mind whenever he came over to see Denki, just to ensure that the boy hadn't actually died right before his very eyes a few hours prior. Izuku also learned that Denki liked walking up and smelling the food, knowing that Izuku was already there as he got ready for the day. Izuku just threw the fish in the oven when Denki came down the stairs and rested his forehead against against the back of Izuku's shoulder as Izuku continued to sip his coffee and flip the eggs. "Hey, Izuku," Denki asked, slurring his words a bit. Izuku hummed and felt Denki shift around a bit before he continued. Why do you use all of your power?" "What do you mean, Denki-kun?" Izuku asked, intrigued what Denki was thinking about. If Izuku learned anything from these time loops, it was to never underestimate Denki. The boy's attention was hard to grab, sure, but Denki was an absolute beast whenever he was fighting, since he could focus on so many different things at once. Denki just groggily hummed from behind Izuku as he lifted his arms and wrapped Izuku's waist and snuggled closer. "You always use all of your power whenever you fight, but you taught me that I didn't need to, and turned me into a human taser, so why do you do it?" Izuku blinked to himself and ignored the urge to scream at his past self for being so stupid as he turned off the oven. "I don't know, actually. I guess I always just assumed that I'd have to use 100%. That seems silly now that I say it out loud, though." Denki snorted and finally released Izuku as he wandered over to the rice maker that was beeping. "It doesn't seem silly." Izuku smiled and rolled his eyes fondly. With a domestic ease that came with isolated existential crisis constantly happening, Izuku and Denki flowed around each other in the kitchen, expertly grabbing the plates and utensils and moving the pan of food over to the dining room table. Denki plopped down in his chair as Izuku refilled his coffee and sat across from Denki, immediately feeling the other boy's socked feet come to rest on Izuku's thighs. Something interesting Izuku learned about Denki was that he didn't need coffee or anything caffeinated to keep him energetic. The electricity that was constantly flows throughout his neurological brain waves keep his dopamine levels high. This isn't to say that Denki couldn't get sad or depressed. The time loops made that particular fact quite clear when Denki would wake up and cry for the losses he had seen that no one else would remember, but the boy was constantly feeling the urge to do something, unable to sit still for any moment. And Izuku learned quickly enough Denki doesn't necessarily think inside the box. True, Izuku tends to spend his time looking for answers so far out the box that no one really knows how he came up with the conclusion that he did, but Denki, he doesn't even know where the box is, which is why Izuku always so fascinated by the way what Denki has to say. The other boy comes up with the idea that would have taken Izuku weeks or months to think about. So Izuku decides to think about one for all in relation to percentage as he ate. If he was using the quirk at 100%, then obviously he can handle the drawback. But if he can lower the output maybe around 20%, or so, then Izuku could potentially use his quirk without any issues and not have to fight through pain of shattered arms anymore. Honestly, it sounded like a dream come true. The idea of using his quirk at less than 100% was his dream come true, but as it turns out, Izuku can only really get it up to 5% at the time, which means he used 20% against the villains and still ended up breaking his bones. Although the skin around it wasn't as dark as purple as it was whenever he shattered his arm, so he whooped and hoolered for joy. Even as he was violently grabbed by the Nomu and flung across the fountain, he pushed the quirks into his leg, twisted in the air, and landing shattering the middle area of the fountain, causing water to spray everywhere. Izuku watched as Denki backed up and stepped in the water zone and fried everyone touching the water. As he jumped up, cackling to himself a bit, when Denki looked at the ground and fucking shrugged before he turned around and kept fighting. But they both knew they were fighting a losing battle since they hadn't had the time to destroy the Nomu quite yet, and Handyman was still scratching his neck furiously as he watched Izuku and Denki decimate their firing squad. Nomu, Handy screamed as Izuku landed beside Denki. Kill those brats. Izuku groans as Denki mumbles, "Not this shit again." And they both dodged the monster as they came flying towards them. Izuku could hear Aizawa screaming vibrate through his mind as Nomu grabbed Denki and broke his arms before stabbing it into Aizawa and to Denki's torso and violently ripping it out, dropping Denki to the ground with his own ripped out flesh and blood mixing in with water below him. He just let the Nomu grab him and shot a vicious smirk towards Shigaraki as the Nomu snapped Izuku's arm clean into two before slamming him down over and over on the plaza floor. He felt himself splash in the pool of his own blood, giggling to himself as though of what happened to Aizawa during the first sloop before gagging on his own blood. He almost felt bad for the hoarse and raw Aizawa-sensei's scream, but he knew the man wouldn't remember this in a few hours, so Izuku let himself be smashed into the plaza 2 more times before he suddenly blacked out without a warning. Izuku smashed his alarm again, not even caring about the dent he made into the wall since he knows that he won't be winning the loop today. He grabbed his school uniform, stuffed it in his bag, grabbed his keys, and walked out the door, determined to see Denki alive and well before he could actually start his day. His walk to Denki's was short. Maybe he didn't remember the whole thing. Either way, Izuku finally found himself walking through the front door, setting all his stuff in the genkan, and laid out on the couch before breathing in deeply. He knows he'll feel 10 times better when he actually sees Denki, but for now this is enough. Just being here was enough. Izuku let himself play on his phone, still very upset that he couldn't access any new sites or hero forums because of this damn time loop. He let himself lose track of time, and as he laid there, trying to think of other attacks and what they need to do differently this time. Izuku heard Denki call out for him. Izuku popped his head over the couch and slowly smiled as the other boy relief coursing through his mind as he looked at Denki alive. "Hey, thanks." Denki turned towards him and walked over to the couch, unceremoniously dropping onto Izuku, pulling a grunt from him. Denki circled his arms around Izuku and just held him tight. Izuku didn't mind the occasional zing that sent sparks through him as Denki hugged him. If anything, they reminded him that Denki was alive and here with him. "I have an idea," Denki murmured into Izuku's hair, shifting slightly to lay completely on Izuku. Izuku hummed and ran a scarred hand through Denki's hair, marveling at how soft it was, and despite how it looked. "Knives." Izuku grinned and tugged on Denki's hair a bit, encouraging the other boy to look at him in the eyes. "Knives?" Denki nodded with a faint smirk pulled onto the other boy's lips as he looked down at Izuku. Yeah, I want knives. Izuku hummed as he pretended to contemplate it, even as a smirk overtook his grin. Knives sounds like an amazing idea. Who are we going to go first? Denki's smirk grew wider and much more vicious as he thought about their first victim, Nomu. This loop 10, it was the most promising loop that the two boys had ever had. Before they got to class, they ran into the support course lab and begged for knives to be added to their hero costume. Thankfully, nobody asked too many questions, although they had to wonder why it was so easy for weapons to be approved and given to them within the day. Questions for when they were not dealing with a never-ending time loop. Afterwards, they could hardly sit still through the morning class. It was getting more and more difficult to talk about the same thing with their friends and pull out their bright smiles for their class and teachers, but they managed to fool everyone. The last time they asked for help, they were looked at like they were going insane, and they refused to be banned from the field trip just because people think they were losing it, so they opted to keep quiet. And then they were on the bus traveling to the USJ. The two boys were set on with determination and nerves running through them, despite the obvious exhaustion weighing on their shoulders. As soon as they were in the building, they made their way towards the front, not willing to take their eyes off the fountain even for a second. When they wrapped the gates around, Izuku launched himself onto a landing pad where, standing out, his quirk coursing through his body, ignoring whatever Aizawa-sensei was yelling about. He heard Kaminari join him a second later, dashing through the stairs. They quickly met a fray of villains and took them out until it was a small crowd left. Izuku made a mad dash towards the Nomu as Shigaraki screamed for the Nomu to kill him. Denki covered Izuku by going low and sending lethal shocks towards his knives and plunged them into the leg of the monster, while Izuku launched himself upwards and stabbed the exposed brain, repeatedly, not pausing to let them regenerate and take over. Distantly, Izuku could hear Shigaraki screaming about his experiment in Rouge character. Izuku coughed to him as Denki shouted, "I bet you have a sticky controller, don't you, handyman?" Izuku cackled at that, distantly registering how insane he sounded before he felt the air shift and curse loudly as he jumped off the Nomu, especially avoiding the warp gate that Kurogiri had sent this way. Denki's own curse was cut off as the warp gate sent him away, hopefully not outside the USJ or anything. That was an unknown, and Izuku was not growing fond of unknowns at this point. And Izuku took off, intent to stab Shigaraki at least once before they died. Izuku threw his knife and grinned evilly when he noticed that it had embedded itself in the palm of Shigaraki's hand. And Kurogiri sent him away in a warp gate, landing into a shipwreck zone. This time landed in the water and opened his eyes to be greeted with a grin of a shark's mouth. Izuku screamed and slashed with his remaining knives, but failed to see his eel mutant behind him was paralyzed as soon as they reached him. Izuku felt unconscious, dim, even before they went at him, since he was slowly drowning. He could feel sharp weapons held against his throat as he shut his eyes. He wasn't really sure what killed him this time, but he knew he went out screaming in pain. "I am here, I am." Izuku smashed the radio into pieces, ignoring his almost broken desk and groaning as he sat up in bed. He felt sluggish and much more tired, knowing better than to think that his problem would be solved with coffee at this point. He made his way to the bathroom, frowned at his eyebrows. He saw the newest scar along the side of his neck. Gingerly, he ran his fingers across the shark bite mark. Gingerly, he ran his fingers across the sharp bite mark embedded in the side of him and held back a bile threatening to surface. Did they really eat him? Izuku had faced death, actually died 10 times now, but he'd never been eaten before. There was something different when he realized that he was literally taken out by gross, leering cannibals this time. Jesus, he wanted to throw up, or actually stay dead one of these times. Izuku quickly shook the thought away, berating himself for thinking such a thing. He might want to die true, but he refused to leave Denki stuck in this harsh cycle all by himself. He just forced himself to take a shower, basking in the hot water before throwing on his school clothes and walking out the front door, keys and notebook in hand. During this walk, he couldn't help but glance around in surprise. A few loops ago, Izuku could have sworn the grass in his neighbor's yard was vibrant and green, then a dully muted color. The more he looked around, the more he saw other things losing color slowly, as if the color was becoming obsolete in this time-looping world, and the two boys were trapped in. What made it worse, it was people, other citizens who were walking around in the morning, just as they did every day morning of this time loop, were drained in color. The hair, eyes, skin, clothes, accessories were slowly fading. Some were already graying. Izuku couldn't help but wonder if it was dependent on the original color or some unknown time limit on specific items. Maybe this phenomenon would be attributed to the time loop, since no one else seemed to find any issues with their dull, muted colors and continued to go around their day as normal. Izuku just shook it off, and he was in no position to care about the colors of the world right now. He'd deal with the issue later, because there has to be a later. Izuku decided to sprint the rest of the way to Denki's house, knowing he would have been caught up in looking around if he hadn't done so. He let himself in, like every other loop, made his way to the kitchen and started on a boring meal while he opened up his fresh notebook. He needed to think about this logically. The knives were undoubtedly helpful throughout their endeavors, so those will need to stick with them. The quirk usage is good, better than Izuku could have ever hoped for, but it still isn't enough to let the two of them brute force their way through the villains. But although a hand-to-hand combat could rival present Mike's at this point in time, though they'll need to focus more on footwork as they want to be on par with Eraserhead soon. Izuku sighed as he sat his pencil down and turned around to wash the rice and start the rice maker. He made his way over to the stove and whipped up some eggs, carefully adding a bit of milk and spices this time. Izuku smiled to himself as he fondly remembered the morning Denki had gotten on him about not adding anything to their food, and talked about how spices were something the other boy gets excited about tasting, since a few of his taste buds had been fried, presumably from his quirk. He poured in the eggs onto the pan before setting the bowl down and bellying towards the coffee machine. After his coffee had been made and the eggs and rice and fish had been plated, Izuku sat down at the dining table and got to work with his notebook once again. Your strategy was usually consisted of keeping everyone alive and knocking out the big baddies. The immediate jump into the plaza seemed like the best bet, since no one but them had outright died when they did so. Granted, whenever Aizawa-sensei got too much attention from Shigaraki, the man-child would execute him via Nomu before focusing on Izuku and Denki. So, what do they need to change? Maybe if they can guarantee their classmates and teachers' lives, all while escaping death themselves, things will go back to normal. Although they have no outside help coming once they enter the USJ. Izuku remembered the first time loop where Aizawa had asked Denki to use his quirk in hopes of letting them contact the main campus. "Hey, Zuzu," Denki called out as he draped his arms around Izuku's shoulder and placed his chin on Izuku's head. Absentmindedly, tracing Izuku's newest scar along his neck. "What you writing?" Izuku just sighed, leaning back to enjoy the comfort Denki was giving him, sliding his eyes closed as he gestured towards the notebook. "Everything we know. I want to see what strategy we should try next." Izuku heard Denki hum as he leaned over Izuku and started flipping through the pages, consuming the information almost as fast as Izuku had written it out. "What about going to Handy first?" Izuku snorted at the nickname, but frowned as he thought about it, and lightly shook his head, feeling Denki jerk his chin off of him. "Kurogiri would just come for us. We need to take out their transport first. Then it would just be the Nomu and lastly Handy." Denki hummed in contemplation, but Izuku didn't even need to open his eyes to see the other boy excited with a feral grin. "I'm in." Their new strategy was admittedly amazing. Izuku was too cursed at his past self for not thinking about this sooner, but he knew it wasn't feasible. The first loop was just a new strategy. Izuku refrained from strangling Denki. The first loop was with their new strategy. Izuku refrained from strangling Denki when the boy let out his indiscriminate shock when he jumped down and fried everyone except Kurogiri and the Nomu, accidentally falling into old habits. The next time Denki managed to keep his decibel around 50,000 volts, he targeted Kurogiri's metal chestplate while Izuku grabbed to distract him. It worked, but the Nomu had already started it, beeping on Aizawa Sensei while Shigaraki was in the middle of decaying Sue's face. Izuku and Denki both winced at the sight of their classmate's face slowly becoming a puddle of blood and dust. They had no idea how they would play off a handprint scar on their face if they died like that. Needless to say, they both refused to continue that loop. They had promised that they were going to get everyone out alive, and it would stay that way. There were more failed loops Izuku could mention, more tears that came from his complaints as they cried together and held each other, basking in the morning before the shitstorm, remembering that they were alive and their classmates were still breathing. There were a few times Izuku had cried just looking at Aizawa Sensei in the morning, though he played it off to the best of his abilities. Denki had gotten choked up talking with Ashido and Sero. They trained in the morning with their quirks on the beach, and Izuku got more practice with his quirk as a dial-up and a taser. At the same time, over and over, Izuku would practice running around, getting used to the speed and strength full Kelling gave him, and managed to bump himself up to a solid 8% sometime during the loops. Together, they worked on their fighting style and figured each other out during the loops. They learned each other's moves and predicted each other with much accuracy. Any hero duo would assume they were training with one another for years. They even skipped school a few times to continue practicing, just wanted to see if it would have any effect. A few minutes after the USJ field trip would have started, however, they both fell into a familiar pit of darkness before waking up the next morning. So they both went to school, sat together during lunch, unwilling to separate for that long, although their friends were always surprised by the newfound relationship and the newfound friendship between those two. They leaned onto one another during the bus ride, not even realizing how worried their classmates and friends would get when the two of their lights in the class looked so world-weary. They didn't notice how their friends looked at them with hesitance and nervousness, when their eyes didn't shine in excitement and determination throughout the class. Instead, they held the depth of losing a war. But none of that even mattered for the two of them, since they knew their classmates would not remember how they had felt after the USJ happened, after their friends and classmates and teachers died in front of them once again. They had gotten too close to the last loop only for Nomu to go after Mineta, who hadn't failed to cry every goddamn time it happened. Honestly, Denki and Izuku shared a look before shrugging and not seeing any real harm to continue their loop before Izuku couldn't ignore Tsu's haunting look and Kirishima's terrified gasp. Denki couldn't forget how Aoyama was shaking like a leaf when he saw what happened, nor how Mineta's eyes looked so pained and dull at the destruction and death. So they died. Woke up, Izuku racing over to Denki's, shoving himself to the front door and running to Denki's bedroom and curled up against Denki, let his sobs out, knowing they wouldn't wake up the other boy until his cycle was done. And then Denki woke up and held him, just as Izuku held Denki, and they cried together, trying to reassure one another through their own tears and heartbreak. They sniffled together, and Izuku pulled back Denki's hair when he bent over the toilet and wrenched up something he wrenched up everything he could when the memories haunted him. Denki worked Izuku through his own panic attack, as though being stuck like this, the end nowhere near in sight for them, because Izuku couldn't forget how long it had been. No matter how much he wanted his brain to shut up and forget, he couldn't even stop counting how many loops they had gone through. And he was slowly becoming more and more gray as the time went on. I can't watch you die again, Danks, Izuku cried out, holding tightly the other boy's shirt as he sobbed, flashes of Aizawa's eyes forcibly popping out of his sockets, rolling through the dirt and dust and blood. That was the last time Izuku had ever wanted to see his sensei's eyes the color red. I can't, Izuku wailed, squeezing his eyes closed tighter than before. He continued to sob openly over an undead hero, quiet assurance for Denki's falling deaf to his ears. Denki hummed to himself as he traced Izuku's skin, tapping lightly on his chest. When did you get this one, Zu? Izuku just sighed and traced Denki's scar across his arm slightly, watching the fascination as goosebumps followed the fingerprint. That was my first loop. I was touched by Shigaraki first. Denki sighed, frowning, painting his lips. Gross. Izuku snorted and hummed in agreement. Denki rushed to the bathroom, Izuku hot on his heels as he threw himself onto the ground and started throwing up. Izuku just rubbed circles in his back, holding his hair, and murmured assurance as Denki continued to heave. Once he was just dry heaving, he attempted to speak and grimacing as he swallowed. I just can't watch them die again, he cried out, tears spilling down his face as he heaved again. Izuku just kept whispering, I know. To the other boy as he cried for the losses no one else could feel. Izuku silently tracked over Denki's newest scar, a decaying handprint on the back of his neck, leading down across his shoulder. They skipped school that day and huddled in Denki's bed, content to lay there silent, mourn their losses. Izuku couldn't help but mourn his loss of wanting to help everyone. Because while it was true he wanted to help people, he knows that he would only ever help the innocent. He would only be able to bring himself to feel empathy for the ones who were being hurt and broken. He cried quietly and slowly, feeling himself slip into a familiar, daunting darkness with a goodbye stuck in his throat. I am here. I am. Izuku tossed his alarm clock into the wall, using a percent or two of one for all. He sighed as he looked at a new hole he created flopped into his bed. I love you, All Might, but please. He couldn't help but plead out to any deity or existing gods as he spoke, tears pricking the corner of his eyes as he whispered, If I'm going to hear your voice every morning, I need you to save us. He winced as his voice cracked. Or save me from doing something I might regret. We're gonna win this, Denki said deceivingly, looking over at Izuku, who was staring into his coffee mug seated at the dining table. Izuku lifted his head up and could only smile at the other boy as he saw his hair almost glowing a bright yellow compared to the rest of his graying body, and the determination lining Denki's form as he tensely made their pancakes and bacon. We're gonna win this one, Izuku let himself repeat quietly, with all the weight he was feeling behind it. The determination that day never faded from their bodies as they confidently went through their new normal. Both boys had given up note-taking anything for the classes. At this point, answered their teachers' questions with ease and made light conversations with their friends, strode up onto the bus in their full hero gear, just ignoring Aizawa Sensei's look of interest during the ride as Denki and Izuku field their classmates' questions and conversations like pros. They completely agreed. Both Aizawa Sensei and 13 Sensei protested for them walking down the stairs before speech was even given and avoided Aizawa Sensei captures weapon with ease. Neither boy stuttered at their footstep when Aizawa Sensei explosion threat rang out, silencing the confused cries from their classmates. Stationed at the fountain, Izuku stood a few paces behind where Kuguri always showed up, with Denki at his side, continued to ignore the anger and confusion being pointed towards them. And then the villains arrived. Before anyone could even notice, Denki lifted up and tased Kurogiri from the back with his metal armor as best as he could, while Izuku swung his arms, cracking with his own lightning, and landing a blow where they assumed Kurogiri's temple would be. As Kurogiri fell to the ground, dark mist shifting violently as an unconscious state, both boys gave each other a vicious grin and turned towards their target. As expected, Shigaraki, aka Handy, called out a frantic order from the Nomu while he scratched his neck, but the boys had gotten faster, stronger, and hungrier. They dashed towards the Nomu before order was even out of Shigaraki's mouth when Denki's taking out the Nomu's leg once again. Izuku launched himself upwards and landing his knives in the exposed brain. He tore and stabbed and slashed through the brain in the brain matter, grinning as he listened to the torturous sound coming from the Nomu as he did so. Denki expertly slashed at well-known tendons in the legs, using his electricity to make the Nomu seize up. When he noticed the regeneration ability wasn't working anymore, they listened as Shigaraki called another order out for Nomu as it was falling over. Izuku rolled off the head and watched as Denki dashed out from underneath the leg as he crashed into the ground and lay completely still, dead. The blood loss from the two were palpable, and they turned their attention towards the leader with their final target. You goddamn rogues! What the hell are you doing at this level? Shigaraki screeched frantically, scratching his neck as the blood dripped down his nails, looking back and forth between Kurogiri and Nomu. Denki and Izuku just walked forward, still grinning viciously at their target. Denki flipped his knife as Izuku spoke, letting a malice and hatred drip out his tongue, deterring anyone from his firing squad from interfering. I've been wanting to do this since day one, hand job. Denki snorted and tossed his knife up against as Izuku quickly flicked his own and threw it towards Shigaraki's neck Shigaraki's hand. Unfortunately, Shigaraki moved his hand forward, so it didn't go through and sliced his neck, but Izuku will take that. Izuku will take what he can get for now. As soon as that happened, Denki rushed forward and started going toe-to-toe with the villain as Izuku jumped over and tried to get hits in from behind. Shigaraki got a lucky grab in, taking Izuku's arm on with his hand as the villain grinned to himself. The grin was quickly wiped off his face as it contorted into one of a pained one. Izuku twisted then around and stabbed Shigaraki in the back, right through his spine, twisting and ripping upwards before wrenching the thing out, not even making a face from his own injuries. He ripped his arm again from the villain and let his grin grow wider when Shigaraki hit the ground, hands spazzing erratically and moaning in misery. Then gleefully bound over to Izuku and accidentally stepped on Shigaraki's head hard and giggling at the pain whine. Izuku watched as the cannon fodder looked around, clearly uncomfortable from the length Denki and Izuku were prepared to go to defend their classmates. One idiot glanced between them and the dead Nomu before scoffing and walking up to them confidently. I thought you lot were supposed to be heroes. Izuku and Denki giggles at the same time, grinning wider. We're not heroes, silly, Denki admonished, bashfully ripping the knife out of Shigaraki's hand. We're students, Izuku finished, giving his own cackle as raced forward and flipped over the man before kicking him hard in the back of his head. As he fell forward, Denki gripped him and smashed his head onto his knees, letting him crumble to the ground once he let go. They looked at the others and smirked in tandem. Well, they sat together, watching in fascination as the crowd shivered. Would anyone else like to try? They tilted their head innocently, widening their eyes with an eagerness as the other villains took a few steps back, obviously not expecting this outcome. Suddenly, a dramatic, painful groan came from behind them, and they whipped around to look at their still moving target, not seeing a wave of relief that washed over the others once their attention was turned. Damn NPCs and rogue players in surprise levels, Shigaraki screamed from the floor, moaning and groaning as he readied around to glare at them. You're trying to ruin everything. Izuku burst out into laughter as Denki said, duh, while the hand villain just glared at them some more. He stalked forward as Shigaraki's eyes snapped back to him, and he hummed, pretending to contemplate the villain's words. Well, Shigaraki, Izuku started, part of him purring in pleasure, as he noticed the villain shook, not expecting Izuku to know his name. If you want us to ruin everything, we can make that happen. Shigaraki just sneered. You hero brats hardly know how to eliminate cannon folders, much less me, obviously ignoring the dead experiment that laid a few meters away from them. Izuku hummed again, and Denki snorted. You're right, we wouldn't want to eliminate you, he said, pretending to be taken aback at the idea, even as he smirked. But of course, that wouldn't stop us from doing other things. Izuku walked back next to Shigaraki and stepped on his wrist before crunching down on the villain's side. You know, something interesting about the 5-point touch quirk is that you all have different nerves running through your fingertips, he said in a dreamy tone, even as Denki snickered to himself and stepped on Shigaraki's other hand before crunching down and mimicking Izuku's pose. But of course, we couldn't just get rid of your quirk by, say, chopping off your finger or hand. The body would just find some way to redirect the quirk into a new outlet. Izuku almost laughed at the tentative relief that sentence seemed to bring the villain as he watched Denki trance his fingertips over the wound, filing the nerve endings into his spine as Shigaraki choked up a scream. What someone would have to do to get rid of a quirk like that would be to essentially sever nerve connecting to the spinal cord. Interesting, right? Denki hummed and nodded along, pretending to be very interested in the story Izuku was telling. A sharp gasp was a thing that brought Izuku out of it, as he zoned into one person who would dare bring him out of his twisted mindscape before he gasped, as well as his eyes went wide. He didn't pay any attention to the other villains as he hastily got fumbling to keep his jaw from dropping. He's alive! He's alive! Izuku breathed out, hardly aware of Denki jumping up as well, paying attention to what Izuku was looking at. Holy fuck, Denki said just breathlessly. They didn't even notice the remaining villains part of this like the Red Sea for them as they raced over to Aizawa Sensei and hugged him. They cried in relief, sobbing openly as they inspected Aizawa for any injuries, crying harder when they found none. Denki moved himself to hug Izuku when he found himself overcome with relief. He couldn't give the energy to control the small outburst of his quirk. Izuku responded in a kind and latched on to Denki, sobbing with the boy as they both wore wide and bright smiles, hope flooding into their eyes and tentative amount of colors coming back into banishing the gray. Shoto narrowed his eyes as his students before turning to look at the other villain, surprise overtaking him when they all watched the scene with varying levels of horror and hurt. Probably because of the assumption of his death to concern the kid. Probably because of the assumption of his death to concern for the kids. Shoto just turned his attention back towards the students, who evidently knew about the villain attack and were surprised at him being in one piece, as if they had a chance to take much action since the two boys had taken out the villain leaders with a brutal, alarming efficiency. What? Shoto said. It was not a question, not a request. He needed to know what was going on. He almost dropped his quirk when he saw both of them smiling even wider. More tears flooded down their cheeks as they sighed in relief, like getting their quirks taken away from them was a good sign. 37, Midoriya said breathlessly, nodding in agreement with Kaminari before holding onto the other boy's hand tightly. Shoto raised his eyebrow but did not comment. We've been stuck here for 37 days. Kaminari choked out, still letting his eyes rove Shoto's body in wonder, as if he couldn't believe Shoto was standing before them. He just crossed his arm and glared harder. How? Midoriya sniffed as he tried to pick up his jaw off the ground to explain. We think it's a time loop quirk, Shoto listed as soon as the villains for hearing reached sucked in a deep breath, wondering what that was about. We've lived this day for 37 days. Shoto tried to wrap his mind around it. Even Midoriya hesitantly came forward again before diving in for another hug. Kaminari seemed to be restraining himself, but one look from Midoriya had him jumping onto Shoto again, making him grunt in a sudden wait. It wasn't that hard to imagine everything, since both of them looked too relieved to find him alive, although he still had his worries and more than a few questions. Apparently one of the villains was confident enough to ask him the most burning questions, as he tentatively hugged the students back. How did it reset? Both boys whipped their heads around and dropped into an obvious practice combat stance, ready to defend Shoto with their lives as they snarled and kept a hand on him, keeping him behind them. Midoriya tilted his head, and then Kaminari shrugged as they loosened up a bit. Midoriya shook his head, and Kaminari nodded before they both relaxed. If Shoto had any doubt before then, they were completely erased now. No one could or should be able to read another to read each other like that in their home. No one could or should be able to read each other like that in his homeroom. Hell, most of the pro heroes should have worked with can be capable of such flawed communication. We died. Midoriya said bluntly like this, like it didn't even matter. Shota just stared in horror at the back of the two students' head, not watching to see the villains do the same. Kaminari just waved them off at his hands. Don't worry, guys. You never killed us. Shota glanced over them, begrudgingly feeling a bit of respect for the villains remaining, even if not killing children was the lowest bar they have. He saw one tension in the form despairing at the new. Shota and a few others, though, glanced over at the unconscious or dead villains covered in hands, and definitely dead monster that was called a Nomu and probably unconscious Miss Villain. One of the villains cleared their throat nervously and just pointed over their shoulders at the lackeys villains covered in hands, as if that was even a proper question. To his surprise, both the boys hummed in unison as Midoriya nodded. He killed most of us, actually, on more than one occasion. Kaminari nodded along, hesitantly, not noticing or not caring that their company was rapidly paling right alongside Shota. He was trigger happy, so to say. The villain had just asked, just tensed and nodded, so that was karma. Shota felt the chill run down his spine, and the two boys immediately shook their head, and Kaminari ominously said, "That was the beginning." He paled again at the admission, and Shota just brought his hand down on either one of their shoulders, and tense but easy relaxed when they remembered who it was behind them. We'll speak about this when you two didn't tell me about it. We'll speak about why you didn't tell me about this later. You both need to get to an ambulance and speak with the detective once you're ready. Midoriya whipped his head around, wide eyes, and stared at him. You're coming, right? He whispered. Shota just glared as he saw Kaminari use the goddamn puppy eyes, and that Midoriya was doing inside intent. Shota glared as he saw Kaminari use the same goddamn puppy eyes that Midoriya was doing inside internally as he felt himself cave. But really, he would never deny his traumatized students much of anything right now. Not when they were so obviously needed someone to associate comfort and safety with. Even if he didn't know why that was him, he can do it. Yes, I'm coming with you too, Shota said, watching his attention he didn't even notice drain out of them. They suddenly looked like tired and vulnerable young kids. Their eye bags were prominent against their skin. White marks imprinted on their bodies were visible to him now, making Shota want to kick himself for not noticing them earlier. He just nodded and glared at the remaining villains for good measures before walking them slowly up to the stairs and silently towards the police and ambulance car waiting for them outside. They both dropped to the ground, crying once again after they stepped out, holding on to each other desperately as their eyes hungrily took out the outside world. Shota clenched his jaw in worry and a pain for what he imagined what they had gone through alone. They couldn't imagine the strength they must have fighting to make it through 37 days of hell. He couldn't begin to even think about the bond they must have made that time. They'll be questioned heavily, that's something Shota positive about, but he refused for anyone other than the detective Naomasa to talk with them. Knowing that he was the best detective at getting kids to open up, knowing whether or not they were lying about it at all. Afterwards, he'll probably have to force them through some mandated therapy, especially since they didn't seem to understand when to register a threat when someone is trying to help them. It was inexplicably heartbreaking to watch Kaminari and Midoriya refuse different ambulance on the way to the hospital. Midoriya didn't even break a sweat, threatening to refuse care, even as blood dripped on his fingers from a large, decaying area on his forearm, acting like it wasn't a bother in the slightest. They'll also take a morality and ethical class of Shota's, just so he can guarantee that the borderline torture and brutal murder, even if it was a monster that happened today, was just a snap or something that they could come back from. But that was all for the future Shota to worry about currently. Shota was just dealing with a clingy Midoriya who was ignoring everything but Shota and Kaminari. Kaminari laughed at the paramedics' obvious distress over the situation happening in their ambulance and refused to care until Midoriya was taken care of. He sighed and texted the detective to bring coffee for him before putting his phone away, and finally decided to try and pry Midoriya off of him towards a worried paramedic. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. Iwata Iwao, test subject 544109. Type normal resistance. Currently undergoing nomufication phase 4. Beginning age 28, current age 35, blood type AB-. Quirk name Colorblind. Description: eye contact based on quirk that allows the user to manipulate another person through previous or current events repeatedly dependent on the user's knowledge of said events. Modified description: no longer requires eye contact. User has to have spatial recognition of another person to result in the users being able to loop back time for a specific event at their will for another person within 24 hours of said spatial awareness being made during the loop back. The person during the loop back, this person will have complicated contact with the outside world, extent currently unknown. Notes: if said person cannot complete their time loop in a timely manner, their surroundings will become grayer and muted. See test 14B to 14Q. Once the persons are grayed completely, they will die during their loop back, and the process will break for everyone. Loop back will occur no longer, and the timeline will go back to normal with the persons deceased. Warning: users must have a strong mental image of the event and place they want people to loop back into. Failure to do so will result in a haywire loop back that will leave difficult repercussions on everyone's psyche, user and persons. The user will experience phantom pains that said person feel whenever an injury/death occurs. Although research shows that the user will gain no scars, see tests 42A to 42J. The user's psyche will feel the person's most powerful emotions during the loopback and must be prepared to handle themselves accordingly. Additional notes: the number of loopbacks are entirely dependent on the will of the person involved. The graying of themselves will be completed once their psyche and will to live is destroyed. The graying is inconsistent between the two or more people experiencing the continuous loopback and can be contracted by an unknown sources. If the person's will is stronger than the user's, the loopback can be defeated and forcibly remove the grayness from their world. See USJ Attack Test 231A to 232K for future reference. Chapter 2: The Aftermath. Summary: what happened after a time looping quirk holds you hostage for a little over a month? Let's find out. Notes: alrighty, this is just the bare bones of an aftermath for now, and a few thoughts and feelings about what the two went through the USJ. I'll come back and edit this more when I can. Actually, I will leave that for the next time because my throat is hurting and it's kind of long, and this has already been an hour and 25, so, well, almost 25, so yeah. Anyway, I'm sorry for the stuttering, for the yawning. Oh my god, I'm so sorry. I kept yawning and repeating, and I'm sorry, but this is such a good fucking fic, and I was so close to crying sometimes. And also, I don't know if y'all heard, but a few times I laughed, and I shouldn't laugh because literally the times I laugh are like the worst times to laugh at, but like, you know, how else are you supposed to react to traumatic events? Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this. I'll record chapter 2 tomorrow. And I hope you guys enjoyed. It's like 12:19. I have school in the morning, so I'm just gonna get this edited real quick. Not gonna take me too long. I'm not gonna do too much editing. I don't think I'm gonna cut out that reading out the chapter 2 and all that stuff, because you know what? It's fine. Anyway, I am sorry, and I will be recording chapter 2 tomorrow with the chapter 2 of the previous, well, not chapter 2, but the 2 other chapters from my previous podfic also. I just really wanted to read this fan fiction, and I'm like, if I'm gonna read it, I'm just gonna make a podfic of it right away, so let's do it. And I did it, and it was worth it because it's such a good fic. So anyway, I'm gonna shut up because I see that most people usually skip through this end part. So, but thank you. Hope you like and subscribe. I appreciate all your support and your comments. I will always reply to them as fast as I can. I love you, and please take care of yourself. Bye.